Hello, this is Dr. Tirrell, and today we're going to be looking at logo design for our design tutorial video. So what are we trying to get out of this? One thing is a familiarity with vector graphics. Heretofore, we've been using pixel or raster or bitmap graphics. Those are graphics that are essentially stored as a bunch of little dots, right? So things like resolution and scaling and changing shape. Those things are really relevant when you're talking about raster graphics because when things are stored as a bunch of dots, that means you can have issues with scaling because the computer doesn't know, what information to put in there or how to change things around without pixelating. With vectors, this is a different graphic format. It's a different kind of thing. Information is stored essentially as mathematical equations. So lines, circles, polygons. That's the kind of graphics we're dealing with here. Because of that, resolution is not an issue with vectors. They're infinitely scalable, in theory, infinitely, or have infinite resolution, because it's just math. If you want to make it bigger, you just multiply, basically. The computer does it behind the scenes. If you need to scale things or rotate it, it's all just math. We're not dealing with a bunch of little dots here. So it does have those advantages. The potential disadvantages are that it does tend to be line art or cartoon art because, as you can imagine, it'd be very, very difficult to try and describe something like a photograph as mathematical equations, right? It just doesn't really lend itself to that. So we'll talk about this more in class, and we've already talked about it a bit, but that's what we're dealing with here, vector graphics. Vectors are very common in things like logos because you're going to need them in all sorts of different sizes, and generally logos are, for readability and recognizability, iconic, right? They look like line art or cartoons rather than photos. We're going to get some experience using some vector design tools like MethodDraw is an online basic vector tool. So we'll look at that first because it's a good place to get our feet wet. And then we'll turn to more sophisticated desktop tools. Adobe Illustrator is the industry standard vector design tool. Inkscape is the open source equivalent. And they both do pretty much the same thing as we've seen, in other places like, Photoshop and GIMP do pretty much the same thing, but the interface is different. The user friendliness perhaps is different. Just the models are different, as we've been examining throughout this semester. The approach to software is different, and that has different effects. We saw it also in InDesign and Scribus, which are typesetters, and now we'll see it in vector design tools like Illustrator and Inkscape. So let's go ahead and get cracking. So anywho, this is our syllabus on our course website. I wanted to go here because there are links to all these programs and services on our syllabus. Let's first go to MethodDraw here. Now what this is it's a very kind of basic vector image software. Now there are, on the raster side, there are online raster graphics packages. Now we didn't look at any of them because almost ubiquitously, almost uniformly, online graphics, raster graphics packages only handle screen resolution. They only do 72 dots per inch. They won't even tell you. They don't even give you an option to change resolution because they're only dealing in screen res. For our purposes, we need to be designing in print res when we're dealing with raster. So we didn't in class look at any online raster graphics packages. Now that we're looking at vectors, it doesn't matter. Resolution is not a factor. It's not really a thing for vectors. Technically it is because we're always looking at pixelated stuff, but don't worry about that. In theory, you're not dealing with resolution when you deal with vectors. So an online service, an online graphics package that's dealing in vectors, it doesn't matter. Resolution isn't an issue. So this one, MethodDraw, is a very kind of simple, stripped down vector package, and it works just as well as anything else. You're going to be producing the same kind of images. In fact, it exports to a vector format called SVG, or Scalable Vector Graphics. So you can see our interface here. We just got some basic things, file and edit in terms of cut and paste. objects, the things we're going to be dealing with, and then view and things like snapping to a grid, to a line, things and that kind of stuff. But you can see it's very stripped down. Over here we have canvas. If we want to change that, we can just change the numbers here. Whoops, actually I have to type them in. You can see you can change the color of the canvas if you'd like as well. Ultimately, you're going to be exporting just the image itself, so it won't really matter. And then we have our tools over here. There's some basic things. The select tool, a pencil, so you can draw, you can make lines in different shapes. One thing this does have, which is kind of neat, is it has a shape library here that we can click. And you can see categorize things like basic primitives or polygons here, different kinds of objects, ranging from a t-shirt and a volleyball, like that. And these are all just sort of vector shapes that we can use here. Because they're vectors, we can scale them infinitely. We can distort them, make them tall and thin or short and fat or whatever. And you can see there's different categories here: symbols, nature, imagery. And you'll notice they all look like silhouettes. That's because we're dealing in vectors here again. Think of vectors like clip art, right? It's line art stuff rather than photographs. Anywho, this sort of shape palette here, this is just a little feature of Method Draw that can be really useful. Then we've got our text tool here if we want to add text. One interesting thing about this is they only have 6. It's changed since I saw it before. Fonts here, so you won't get the full complement of fonts that are installed on your computer or anything like that. Just got 6 basic ones here. And then we have a zoom in tool, which we can also do down here, an ink dropper to select colors. And then we've got this interface down here that shows the fill or the body of a shape, and then the outline or the outline of a shape. So what does that all mean? Let's say I want to draw a shape like a rectangle here. So right now, these are both set to black. The fill is black and the outline is black. And you can see some information over here: alignment. We can also see things about rotation, the width and height, so we can change that here. Blur or roundness, like if we change roundness to, let's say, 10, you can see what's happened to the corners there. They've gotten rounded. Let's put that higher so you can really see. There. So that's what it's doing. It's rounding off the corners. Well, get rid of that because I don't want rounded corners at this point. The stroke, what that means is right now our colors are set the same. Let me change the fill color here to just this yellow or whatever, so it's really clear. Now, there is an actual black outline here, but right now its stroke is set to 0. That means there's nothing actually there. If I up this stroke width to 5, let's say, you can see what's happened, right? Now there's a black outline. You can actually change the style here also from solid to a dash or something like that. So that's how this works. If I want to change the outline, I could click that and then set the color there. I can even add gradients, which are fades. You won't be able to see that too well in the outline. We might do something like that on the solid just to show you. But let's change this to like a hot pink so it's really visible. Okay, so you can see how that works. And there's a color selector down here at the bottom, as you can see as well. Let's change the fill here, and let's do a linear gradient. You can see here it's going from one color to another. You can change these colors here. Let's go to a red so it's visible. Right, let's add that, and you can see what's happened. It adds a gradient. It has both linear and radial, or going. It's sort of bursting outward. You can actually change the center as well. One thing about gradients is you can add more than 2 colors. It defaults to 2, but if you click inside there, it gives you more options. You can actually have multiple things in your gradient. Just move that one out. So you can see how that works. Gradients are a little, I won't say heavy-handed or cheesy, but you can kind of see how the effect looks there. Sometimes gradients are really helpful. A lot of times for things like user interface, like a lot of, not so much anymore, but a lot of, windows on your computer, they will have gradients sometimes up in the bar up here to show depth or that kind of thing. But they have their place, but you don't want to overuse them. It's like the synthesizer in the 1980s. Oh gosh, you guys weren't alive for that. Well, it's coming back. The point is, the synthesizer was really kind of hot in music in the 1980s, and it got overused. The synthesizer has its place, but you don't want to use it for everything. That's the takeaway. Oh, that's hideous. I can't look at that. Let's put this in a nice neutral, let's see, a brown or something here. Yeah. So that's how that works. We already watched that video about logo design, and we saw the concrete one that the designer worked up some things for. If we want to do something like that, we could start by drawing a square here, or a rectangle. I'm sorry. I'm going to actually remove this border. I mean, it's pink. We wouldn't do that anyway. But I'm going to go ahead and click on this stroke, right? And then down here at the bottom, do you see how there's one color that looks like a white square with a red line across it? That means nothing. That's different from being white, right? White is still a color, but this means nothing. So if we click that, there's no stroke, there's no outline at all. So we're just dealing with a solid rectangle here. This brown color is nice. I mean, that's earthy for concrete or whatever. And one thing I could do is I could create a rectangle here, and I will make this one white. Oops, I made it stroke white. And I'm going to rotate this here in this rotation selector. Let's see what just 5 gives us. Yeah. So that's pretty good. I'm going to put this here because if you'll remember from that video, he was making essentially a stylized A for concrete. Let's see if we can copy and paste another one of these here. Yep. Let's see if it gives us the ability to reflect. It doesn't look like it. So we can just rotate this. See if it'll let us do -5. Yeah, there we go. Right, so here's something similar to what we saw in the video. Because this is method draw, we can't do kind of sophisticated things like manipulate shapes to the degree that we can with desktop vector packages, but we can kind of fake it. We can kind of see this stylized A. I'm actually going to bump this up to 10 on both sides because right now it's very subtle. So let's bump this up to 10, -10. And we'll shift these in. Oh, and this one's more pronounced. Yeah. There we go. And I'm going to actually look through one of these. What about this tree? I'm going to drop this in here. And you can see I can scale it arbitrarily. I'm going to hold down Shift because that makes it scale both dimensions simultaneously. Well, not simultaneously, locked together, essentially. So you can see how it scales up and down, but it stays in the same ratio. If I let go of Shift, it goes bonks because I can stretch it and squish it and whatever. But if I hold down Shift, it scales in lockstep. So I'm going to do that, and I'm going to move this here. I'm going to move this down just a hair so that it goes through like that. I'm going to make this a little bit smaller. Well, I actually kind of like that it touches. So I am going to stretch this out a little bit horizontally. There. So, this isn't the same logo, but it gives us an idea of some of the things we could do. Let's get rid of this stroke here. And let's make our fill maybe something analogous. Remember, we've looked at color schemes. They're in our handbook. Well, not identical. And actually, probably something lighter would work. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, so you can get a sense of how this works. I'm going to move these, and I'm going to have to move them all up. I'm going to do some typing underneath here. Let's do all base. We probably want a sans serif. Let's go with Helvetica. Classics never die. Bold. And now, interestingly, when you're dealing with fonts, and they're vectorized, you can pretty much scale arbitrarily here, and it's not going to cause an issue. So there's an idea of how we can work with these logos. I encourage you to play around in MethodDraw. It's a good sandbox because there's only so much you can do, but it gives you principles for, okay, here's how I make and move objects. Here's how I scale things. Here's how I use fonts. And there's only, there's only so many things you can kind of get into. So if you start running into issues in terms of, well, how do I do this particular thing or that particular thing, and you're not finding a way to do it, you probably then need to step up to a desktop design package. But this is perfectly usable for playing around, getting a sense of how vectors work, even making kind of quick scaled down logos. It's perfectly fine. When you're finished, you can actually export this. You don't want to export it as a PNG because that is actually a raster format. We're going to save this. And what it's actually doing is it saves it, or it actually presents it as a separate page in your browser. If you look at the code of this, you don't have to, but you can kind of see what it's doing. It's actually using the canvas element in web design, and then it's basically drawing things like that. We can just save this. See where it says download. I just did Control S, I'm sorry. And it's saying download as SVG, which is a scalable vector graphics file. That's what we want. I'll just save that to my desktop there. You can see it's saved to my my desktop here. That is a vector format, SVG. It's sort of more popular on the web than offline, but vectors are vectors. So anything that can read that can deal with it. You can see it actually, Inkscape can read it. So that was method, and that is linked on our course website. If you go to the syllabus, it's just over here. Thank you. It's just over here in the syllabus, and then under required materials, and there's a link right there. And that, as I mentioned, is a really good kind of tool just to play around. You can do quick stuff. You can even just draw using the pencil tool, right? You can render stuff out, and then you can rotate this. You can scale it up. You can align it. You can make the line larger here with the stroke width, or dash it out like that. Let's make this a 6 point, right? So you can just very easily make lines, draw shapes, actually just hand draw, and it'll render it out as a vector for you, which is just fantastic. So this is a really useful tool. Now, it does not have the sophistication of a desktop package like Illustrator or Inkscape. So let's look at those. And I'm not going to spend too much time in this because in keeping with our feedback, I want to keep our focus in these videos just sort of on exposure to these tools. And then when we get into class, when we actually have time in front of our machines, then we can individually start playing with the tools. So this is just an overview. If something whipped by and you didn't know exactly what happened, don't worry about it. That's why we have class. We'll be in there and we can actually just work it out. So this is Illustrator. In a sense, it kind of looks similar to Photoshop or InDesign. All of these Adobe programs in the Creative Cloud suite, they try and share interface as much as they can. So once you kind of learn one, you learn the others. That's, there's only so much they can do because they are different tools, so the interfaces can't be exactly the same, but it looks familiar if we've had experience with the others. I'm just going to make a new document here, and it does have profiles for print and web, and that might weird you out because these are vectors, right? I mean, I thought resolution didn't matter and that kind of thing. It doesn't. What it actually does with these profiles, you don't have to use them at all, it just kind of defaults to it, is you can see what the profile is. The color mode is CMYK, which that 4-color process, we know that's generally for print. It does actually give us a default export resolution here, although since they're vectors, that doesn't really matter. You can see it changes to 72 when we're dealing with web, and it changes the color mode to RGB. But we can change these, and when we're talking vectors, it doesn't really matter. So don't let that weird you out. Vectors are vectors. They're not a pixel-based, they're not a raster-based format. Defaults to points. You might want to do inches just because it's more familiar, but this is a logo, so it's going to be scaling up and down anyway, so I don't know if that's helpful or not. Anywho, let's just open this. So just kind of in keeping with the video, the design video we saw, the all-base one, if we wanted to work up something like that, and you saw on the video, the designer was using Illustrator. Now he was just going really fast because it wasn't a tutorial. He was just kind of showing us ideas. And so I'm sure you couldn't follow what the heck was he doing there? Because he's a professional, so he's just whipping through it. But we can do basically what he was doing, right? So we can draw a rectangle here under this rectangle tool. And you can see, unlike Method Draw, it doesn't have a palette of shapes, but it does have polygons and stars and even this weird flare thing. Anywho, so I'm going to draw a rectangle here. Now, right now, it's filled with white, and it's got a black stroke. I'm going to change that. Let's just get rid of the stroke altogether, actually. You can see this same symbol here for none. And then let's change the fill. Let's go to color swatches. Ooh, this brown palette down here is just perfect. So let's use this nice dark brown as sort of our base. There we go. Now, one thing we wanted to do was make this that stylized A, so we have to kind of shave off the corners or whatever. Now, in Illustrator, that's actually super easy. They kind of showed it in the video, but he whipped through it. We just have to select this thing called Free Transform Tool, and when we do that, it gives us some options. We want to select this one called Perspective Distort. What that allows us to do is I'm going to select a handle up here, and just click, and see what it does. It lets us distort the perspective. Make it sort of foreground or background. So we just need to move it in a little bit, and there, boom, there's our stylized A. Very easy. What else did he do? Oh, he cut this into sections, right, for that stylized A. So let's go ahead and just make another rectangle. And I'm going to change the color. For the thing we're going to do, it actually doesn't matter what color it is because we're going to kind of cut this out. But so we can see it and see what's going on in between these two, I'm going to change this to really anything else. Just use a blue just so we can kind of, you see what's happening. If I use white, as they did in the video, you can't really tell what's happening. So I'm going to just copy and paste this. And paste it again, and you can see it's giving me these helpful guides to show me how they're lined up and if they're equidistant from each other and that kind of thing. So here we have this, and now if I try and move this around, these aren't actually together yet. And what I really want to do is chop this out, right? So I'm going to select these, and I'm going to use, we can use our pathfinders up here. Divide or trim, actually both of those should work. So I use trim, and what that does is it as you might expect from the name, it basically kind of cuts those out. Now it's grouped as one thing, but I can actually select this and then ungroup it. And these are separates now. So if I select this and delete it, you see what's happened? It's cut these into separate segments. Hopefully that makes sense. I use this Pathfinder tool, which is here under Window and Pathfinder. I know there's a billion tools here. As I say, we can walk through this in class. It's one reason why you want to start with Method Draw, because it doesn't have all this stuff. Anywho, so now these are all separate segments, and that means I can change the color of these separately. Let's go back to those swatches. And why don't we just kind of step up each level? So we'll move up, and we'll do it again here. Oops. So now we'll move up 2. And this looks crazy because I double-clicked it, and that means it treats it separately. And color swatches, and we'll move up. Oops. 3 from where we were. 1, 2, 3, right? Let's make this one actually a little lighter just to make this more pronounced, even though it's not perfectly symmetrical. There we go, right? And let's slap in one at the bottom there. So we should be able to go through the same process. Let's make sure those are centered. You can see those helpful things pop up. Ungroup that. There's actually lots of ways to do that, that kind of cutting up an object. So there's our stylized A, right? And we can manipulate these colors separately. If we want to add text, we can just go up to this T, which you'll remember from InDesign and Photoshop. Not sure how the T got. Oh, it's text or type. Been doing this for 20 years, and that suddenly made sense. All base. Now, unlike Method Draw, we're going to have every font we've got installed. So, you know, if we wanted to use Helvetica, and why wouldn't we? It is a sans serif blocky font, probably good for it. But we've got, you know, tons of other things. I think we're using Myriad Pro right now. Yeah. Let's just change the font size here. That's actually good, but we could hand tweak this. Again, I'm going to lock the scaling together. You can see it gave me that helpful green guide to show me when it was just touching the edge there. And we can actually blow this up pretty easily if we wanted that to be even thicker. I'm just actually going to change the stroke. Doot, 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 doot. Now that's a thick font there. Right? So that's pretty similar to what we were seeing in the video, or at least you get the operations of how this works. So that's Illustrator. You can always just save this as an Illustrator file or save it as any number of vector formats. EPS is encapsulated PostScript. That tends to be, it's got a long history of being an offline vector-based format. You'll see SVG is there again. There aren't a ton, actually, of straight-up vector formats. SVG was kind of built for the web, but again, vectors are vectors, so that doesn't really matter that much. Anywho, there are some options there. That gives you the ability to interchange, right? Not everyone can open Illustrator files, but SVG, of course, they can, or EPS. All right, so that's that. Let's take a quick look at Inkscape. I don't want this tutorial to go on for too long so that we can work on stuff in class, actually. This is what Inkscape looks like, and it is even more interface laden, right? There's just tons of stuff here. Everything's just out in the open. That's one reason why I suggest using something like Method Draw first. You don't get this paralyzing fear, right, when you open it and say, I don't know what's going on in this, right? Once you get more familiar with, you know, a vector tool like Method Draw, you can move over into Inkscape or Adobe Illustrator, depending on your preference or, you know, what you have available. It actually does pretty much the same thing as Illustrator. You can see we can create different kinds of shapes here. There is a type tool. Now it has A, right, rather than T. Let's go through kind of the same process. First, let's zoom in here a little bit so we can see. I'm just selecting this rectangle tool, and it's set with this nice kind of teal. Probably I was doing something for school. And it's got the same stroke and fill down here. You can see the stroke is unset. I could set a stroke, but not. I'm going to set the fill here. And if you click this arrow, there are different palettes available. I have it set to khaki. This is the default Inkscape one. You can find a nice similar. Here are those browns, so let's do that. And we can do the same kind of things in terms of shaping. This doesn't have a free transform tool, so we can't easily make that kind of distorted, perspective distorted rectangle, but we can still do it. There's just a couple extra steps. Let's see, and let's go here to, I think it's transform. We'll rotate it. Yeah, that's pretty good. Copy and paste, and let's just reflect this. Boom. Okay, select one, and then, so I've got both of these objects selected and holding down. You can either just draw and select them, or select it and then just hold down Shift and select another. What I'm doing is I'm going to go up to Path, and I think it's Difference. Yeah, what that did is it actually just cut that out, right? And I believe in Inkscape you can only do 2 shapes at a time rather than all 3. I don't think it works with all 3. But boom, end result's the same. We've got our stylized A there, and then we can do a similar process. Ooh, that's too chunky. Let's scale that down. And I'll just do some copy and pastes. And we can select here, and I think we can basically just go through the same process, actually. Difference, 2 shapes, and a difference. And right now, this is still the same thing. And unlike in Illustrator, if you click Ungroup, it actually doesn't do it for you. They understand these objects differently in the 2 different programs, but you can still do it. You just have to go to, I think it's Path, Break Apart. Yeah, that's it. Same deal. Now we can change the colors separately. Oh wait, I don't want to do that. And let's actually use this because that's an orange. This is a nice brown. So let's use that as our base, and then step up and step up and step up. That's a little too orangey. Let's there we go. And you can see what I'm doing here is these are just different color sliders. Depending on how familiar you are with them, you can kind of set these differently so that it's so much orange, but I do probably want to move this into the white spectrum a little bit. Yeah, let's lighten that out, but yeah, there we go. That's probably more what I was thinking. Anywho, oh, and we didn't add that bottom one. I guess it has to be tall enough for both. And I can actually align these with align and distribute. Because see, I didn't get that guide that lets me know I'm smack in the middle. Let's actually line these up. It's not, yeah, there it is. Distribute centers. There we go. Same process, I believe. Oh yeah, let's see, because I only have the 1. Can you actually do this with 3? I don't think you can. No, you can't. So we may have to repeat that. Before I do that, let me just do that really quickly. So you can see how that works. I might actually, I'm not going to go into this, but I actually could, because I don't like how wide that gap there is. So I might actually scale those down a little bit. And that's useful because you can see how I'm doing it. And I also wouldn't eyeball this. I'd do this numerically. Anywho, there's that. So we can add our text here again. And it has its own large set of fonts. You don't hold Shift, actually. In this program, you hold Control to lock the scaling together. If you hold Shift, it actually does something different. Yeah, so that's the gist of how this works. And here we can save as Inkscape or save it as a SVG. It's got a bunch of other formats, including some meta files, which are not exactly vectors. It's a different way of storing information. But you can see there are just some different options there. That's how this works. As I said, our point is just to get some exposure to this so that we can be prepped for what we're going to be experimenting with in class. As I said, it's usually helpful to start with something like the online service method draw, just because it's so much more stripped down. When you bump into, hey, I can't, there's something I need to do and this program doesn't support that, then you need to step up to something like Illustrator or Inkscape. They do basically the same thing. You can see they're just completely feature rich. You can do all kinds of stuff. And they're both pretty similar. There's just, they're different models for how software should operate. And so there are different effects and different interfaces and that kind of thing, as we've been discussing this entire time. So that's that. I will see you guys in class, and we'll get some practical hands-on experience with vector tools as we design our logos. Okay, see ya.